So our focus this evening is on the Christmas story, and we'll get to that. But about 33 years after the events that I read to you in St. Luke's and St. Matthew's Gospel, these events happened that St. Matthew writes in his Gospel also. Jesus, 33 or so years later, was an adult. He was teaching, he was going around the countryside, and it was almost at the end of his ministry, and Jesus told this story. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" He will reply, "I tell you the truth, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Famous American theologian and Sunday school teacher Stephen Colbert said this: "If Jesus commanded us to help the poor and we don't do it, then either we have to confess that Jesus lied or that we refuse to obey him." It's that simple. What does that have to do with Christmas and Christmas Eve? Well, Stephen Colbert wasn't the one who discovered that. Martin Luther preached on that 500 years before Colbert. In one of his sermons, Martin Luther was talking about the Christmas story. And he imagined his audience saying, "Look at this manger scene. Isn't this a beautiful manger scene? But think of Mary and Joseph coming to Bethlehem. And you know that famous line, that there was no room for them in the inn, right? So the baby was born in a stable, and she wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn." And Luther said to his congregation when he preached this sermon, he said, "You imagine that, we Christians imagine that we're full of compassion and mercy for other people, because after all, that's a Christian value. That's what Jesus said we ought to do, right? We ought to be compassionate, and we ought to be merciful, and we ought to be, we ought to do that for one another. That's a Christian value. And besides, as we just heard in that parable, compassionate and merciful people are on this side of the shepherd when he comes again in glory. We don't want to be on this side and get the boot." We want to be known as compassionate, merciful people. And so, if we hear the story, Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem, and she wrapped the baby in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn, because they were so dirt poor they had no money to bribe the innkeeper with and say, can't you find us a little better place? Well, for the right money. Luther said to his congregation, maybe you imagine yourself as saying, if I were in Bethlehem, I would have had a place for them, right? If I were that innkeeper, if I were compassionate and merciful, I would have found a place for them. You know? Maybe you're thinking, if I had lived in Bethlehem in those days, even if I weren't the innkeeper, if I saw these poor people wandering the streets and she's about to burst from pregnancy, I would have said, why don't you come here? Come in my house. All right? My wife and I, you can have our room. We'll sleep on the couch and in the recliner tonight. But you look like you're ready to burst. Why don't you come in here? Or if I were the innkeeper, I certainly would have pushed some guests around and said, you have our room and sleep in this place. Martin Luther said, I know you're all compassionate and merciful Christians, and that's the way you'd think it. That's what you'd like to think of yourselves. And that's probably what we'd all like to think of ourselves. If we were that compassionate and merciful, we would do that for Mary and Joseph and Jesus. And then Luther said an astonishing thing. I'll put it in American English. Y'all kidding yourselves. Y'all kidding yourselves if you think that that's what you would do in Bethlehem, because you're not doing it now. You're not doing it for your neighbors who are out there who are homeless on a night like this. Okay, and don't kid yourselves to say there aren't any homeless people in Medina County, because there are homeless people in Medina County. And there are homeless people in Wayne County. Okay? And if we kid ourselves and say, well, we let Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus in, don't kid ourselves. Because, we're not doing it for our neighbors. Because what we need to understand is the people who are around us, who are our neighbors, are the people that Jesus talks about in that parable. They are Jesus. The poor and the hungry and the thirsty and the ones in prison, they are Jesus. Okay? They're the least of these, and they are Jesus to us. And everywhere in the Christmas story, we see people in our day who represent different parts of not only what Jesus went through, but what his parents went through, what his whole family went through. So, for instance, here's Mary, a teenage girl, suddenly discovering that she's pregnant and she has no husband. How do you think she feels about that? Because in those days, that was a horrible thing. Sometimes in our day, that's still a horrible thing. A girl who's a teenager and pregnant is sometimes faced with horrible choices. And she's pressured on all sides. You should do this, you should do that, you should do the other thing. She doesn't know what to do. And what would Mary do? The angel said, this is what God's plan is. And Mary said, then I'll do it. That's not so easy for a lot of teenage girls these days, though. Because they don't know what God's plan is exactly for them. There's no angels. Unless there's somebody else that comes along inside, like one of us, that says, let me help you with this thought and this choice and this decision. Think about Joseph. Here's Joseph. He's engaged to be married to Mary, and here's the temptation for Joseph as a young man who's engaged to be married. At the first sign of trouble from the girl he's engaged to, what does he do? He thinks, I should bail. I should just get rid of her and I should leave. That's what goes through his mind. Right? I know Scripture says he's minded to divorce her quietly, but that's really what he's thinking. She's going to be trouble. She's betrayed me. She's cheated on me already. I should bail. And who's there to say to him, a believing spouse doesn't bail at the first sign of trouble? A believing spouse is in it for the long run, for the long haul. I don't know if Joseph's parents were alive to tell him that. So an angel came to him in a dream to say, don't bail on this one, Joseph. Because this is going to be the baby Jesus, the Savior. So they get married. They get engaged anyway. They're not married yet. They go down to Bethlehem. She's about ready to have this baby. They have no place to stay. They're dirt poor. They have no money to run. They're without a home. They're temporarily homeless. They're temporarily homeless. And who is there that's going to take them in and give them a place to stay, even temporarily? I don't know. But if you've ever been temporarily homeless at this time of year, you know it can be a real strain on your family and a real problem. And that's where Mary and Joseph and Jesus were. Temporarily homeless in Bethlehem. A few people do a few nice things for them. The shepherds come. The wise men come. They bring gifts. Gold and frankincense and myrrh. If you ever wondered what happened to them, my theory on the gold and frankincense and myrrh is they spent it all when they went down to Egypt and came back, and they had nothing left when they came back. Because when the wise men came, and you heard that part of the deal, and there the wise men are on the manger scene. When the wise men came to visit them, right, they brought gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh, whatever that is, and it's all expensive stuff that only wise men could afford, and they gave it to Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and the next thing that happens is that the wise men have this dream where King Herod says, I'm going to kill that child. And the wise men go home another way, and an angel comes to Mary and Joseph, or to Joseph, and says, take the child and his mother and flee and go to Egypt. And immediately they become immigrant refugees, fleeing a horrible, terrible government that does nothing but want to kill them. And they head for the nearest border into what they think might be a safe place, across the river into Egypt. Now, we don't know if on the other side of the Nile River, if there's a wall, or a fence, or detention camps, or border patrol, or the Egyptian immigration and control, immigrations and customs enforcement. We don't know what awaits them on the other side, but we do know that when they get to Egypt, they're illegal immigrants fleeing a terrible government, a family. We don't know if mom and dad are going to be sent to that camp and the baby to a different camp. We don't know what happened to them in Egypt. We hope and guess that they had enough gold and frankincense and myrrh to pay the fees and the bribes and the immigration lawyers so that they could get back later when the time was right. Who are the least of these that Jesus talks about in the story? He talks about the people who are hungry and naked and in prison and sick and thirsty and all that kind of stuff. But there's a whole bunch of other least of these in our world right now at Christmas time. There's a whole bunch of least of these. And they're all like Jesus. They all have some resonance with the Christmas story. Jesus was conceived before his mother got married. His mother and father weren't sure whether they were ever going to get married for at least a little while. He was an immigrant refugee child, fleeing a dictator who wanted nothing more than to kill him. When they came back, they didn't know where to settle, so they ended up in a hick town in Nazareth. And Nazareth was just about as famous to the people in those days as, say, Lodi, Ohio. What good is there that comes out of Nazareth? One of Jesus' disciples was going to say when they called him to be a disciple. It's kind of like saying, is there anything good that comes out of Homerville? Yeah. Jesus is all around us. Jesus is not just in the manger. Jesus is not just 2,000 years ago. Jesus is not just in our prayers and in our thoughts and in our hearts and souls and in heaven and all that. Jesus is all around us in every single one of these people. And Colbert was right. If we look at the poor and the destitute and the people who are temporarily homeless and the young men who are trying to decide what to do about their relationships and the young women who are trying to decide what to do about their relationships and the pregnant girls who are faced with difficult decisions and the immigrant people and the people who are fleeing horrible governments and even the governments themselves and all kinds of other things, if we look around them and we don't see Jesus, then we need to get something straight. They're all Jesus. They're all Jesus. They're all opportunities for us to say, here is where my compassion and my mercy needs to go. That's what Jesus said. You see one of them, be compassionate to them. Because when you see them, you see me, Jesus said. You see them, you see me. And that's your chance to do something for Jesus. Whatever it might be. You want to worship the newborn King? Is that what we really want to do at Christmas time? This is a good place to start. Or there's a whole bunch of people out there also that need our compassion and our mercy, and when we go out from here, that's where we need to go afterward. Whether that's tonight or tomorrow or sometimes, or in the next year. That's where we need to go to continue to worship Jesus. Sometimes we say, let's keep Christ in Christmas, and I'm going to tell you, let's not keep Christ in Christmas, because Christ is already out there in the world. Let's take Christmas into the world and find Christ and be compassionate and merciful out there. In the name of Jesus, amen.